Encanto is a unique story centered around miracles, the belief that at the toughest moment of your life, something magical can happen. But the story further pushes that sometimes miracles come in shapes that nobody recognizes, and such is the case with Mirabel, who, unlike the other children growing up in Casa Madrigal, possesses no special gift, and thus is sadly viewed as dead weight and inferior. But this doesn't mean that she doesn't possess a miracle. In fact, the film goes so far as to say that we oftentimes make our own miracles. The moral of the story is that everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses, and that sometimes strengths aren't as apparent, but are no less important. But enough about that. We all know why you're actually here. You're here for Bruno, right? And yeah, we'll include other characters too, but that is why you're here, right? And boy, are there a lot of characters. Let's see how much of it I can remember and if I can properly place all of these in a timeline. In an almost unprecedented move, we're gonna use actual years in this video. While the time period is left ambiguous by Disney, we actually can make really well-educated guesses at what year this movie takes place. I'm gonna trust this educated guess because a lot of people who are way smarter than me have told me so with great enthusiasm that this is the correct time period. So, without further ado, this is the timeline of Encanto. And obviously spoilers for the movie if you haven't seen it yet. 1875. Alma Madrigal is born. Through this time, she lives a good bit of her life, about 25 years in Colombia, South America. Around December 7th, during the celebration of the Day of the Little Candles, she meets a man named Pedro, from whom Alma takes her surname after marriage. The two begin to make a life for themselves. 1899 and 1900. Alma discovers that she's pregnant with not one, not two, but 3 children, which almost causes Pedro to pass out. She would eventually give birth to these children. The girls she named Julieta and Pepa, and the boy she named Bruno. Yes, that Bruno, the best boy of the movie. It's during this time that a conflict begins known as the Thousand Days War. This is actually where we get our time period from because of a few clues within the scene that indicate that this is probably the time frame, such as the fact that they still fight on horseback and with bladed weapons. Now, the Thousand Days War began on October 7th, 1899 and lasted until November 21st, 1902. It's a war that began between the Liberal and National parties and later included the Conservative Party within the government. It was the result of a long-standing ideological tug-of-war between the two ideologies of federalism versus centralism following the implementation of the new Constitution of 1886 following the political process known as the Regeneration. Tensions ran high after the presidential election of 1898, which led to open insurrection and civil war. One thing we did notice, though, is that the village that Alma lived in seems slightly similar to Bucaramanga during that time frame, and as such, if this is true, which I'll admit is possible that it's not because I'm not that smart, this would put the birthdays of Julieta, Pepa, and Bruno at around a few days to a week before the 13th of November, 1899. It's during this era of war that Alma and Pedro Madrigal flee with their children and many other villagers in hopes of escaping, only for Pedro to sacrifice himself in an effort to save his family and fellow villagers. It's then that Alma's despair and the hopes of the villagers and the love of Pedro come together to the candle that Alma had brought with her and transformed it into a miracle candle that would never go out so long as the miracle continued. From here, mountains would erupt between the villagers and the pursuing faction to protect them. The candle began to form a house for them, which would serve as protection against those from the outside who would harm them. For years, the Madrigal family lived happily. The children began to grow, and Casa Madrigal would form 3 new rooms, each one representative of the child's special gift and personality, and are instructed by their mother to use their powers to help the others. Pepa's power was weather control via emotion, Julieta's power was healing people through her cooking, and Bruno? His power was precognition, though his power was specifically hated due to how it only ever seemed to see things that people would consider bad in their future. 1920s through 1935, the time they stopped talking about Bruno. Sometime during this era, Julieta and Pepa would get married to their spouses Agustin and Felix Madrigal, respectively. The men seemed to take their wives' surnames instead. It's during this era that the events described in the song We Don't Talk About Bruno take place. Bruno's gift becomes the center of contention. When Felix and Pepa get married on a day of blue skies, our boy Bruno shows up and says it looks like it's gonna rain. Of course, we know from the end of the movie that Bruno was just making a joke because Pepa looked stressed out, and, you know, she can control the weather, and she would make it rain if she was whatever. Due to his alleged prediction, Pepa loses it and generates a freaking hurricane that pretty much ruins her big day. Although Felix did say it was joyous. It's during this time he would inform another villager that her goldfish would die, another he would say would grow a gut, and he told one of the village's priests that he would lose all of his hair. Which are all things that I think would be pretty easy to quote-unquote predict, but whatever. He would also tell Isabella that her life would be perfect, which itself would be a curse to her since she hates being perfect, and she told Dolores that the man of her dreams would be just out of reach. Betrothed to another. During this era, Bruno would disappear from the public eye, and his room would become abandoned. He would begin to live within the walls of Casita, using rats as his friends, slowly losing his sanity and longing for inclusion within his family, patching the cracks that Alma's pressure was creating. Most of the family would try to forget about him, which is just proof of how screwed up they are and the reason why their magic was dying. We also begin to see the birth of the third generation of Madrigals in this time frame. In 1929, Isabella Madrigal would be born. She's not the only one, because a few months later, Dolores Madrigal would be born, and in 1931, Luisa Madrigal is born. In 1935, Camillo Madrigal would be born to Pepa and Felix, and a few months later, Mirabel would be born to Julieta and Agustin Madrigal. 1940s through 1950. One door closes and another opens. In 1940, during her 5th birthday, Mirabel is told the story of her familia, how they struggled and how they were saved by a miracle that would live on in Mirabel. However, as Mirabel goes to open her door, the door mysteriously disappears, leaving her to be the only Madrigal without a room, and the only Madrigal to possess no gift. One could argue that Alma herself is one of these without a gift, but then again, the house itself is her gift. And I suppose that this actually comes full circle, as Mirabel's gift would later become the new Casa Madrigal. In 1945, Antonio Madrigal would be born to Pepa and Felix. He and Mirabel would develop a special relationship, as they both would spend ample amounts of time within the nursery where Mirabel would live with him, play with him, and just generally grow more attached to him than any other person in the family. When the year 1950 rolls around, the story of Encanto begins to take place. Antonio is now 5 years old, and the entire family and even the whole village is getting ready for his birthday, in which he'll get his own room and a gift. However, as you can imagine, he and the entire family and village are as nervous as can be. After all, Mirabel was skipped. They don't want Antonio to have the same fate. It's during this time that the entire family begins to exclude Mirabel, and the theme of the story is revealed. That theme being placing too much importance on the miracle itself and forgetting who these miracles were for in the first place. Thankfully for Antonio, he gets a door and a room, along with a power, and actually fades into the role of tertiary character, only about as important as Felix and Agustin. We could continue to harp on this from the perspective of a film critic, but the movie's still fun, and it's even funner because there's a large family as opposed to a smaller one, and it would be impossible to flesh out every character within the length of the film. Anyway, during this celebration, in which Antonio gets his powers, Mirabel begins to feel excluded, and because of this decides to get some air and discovers that Casita is slowly falling apart. She tries to warn everyone, but nobody trusts her, and even a few accuse her of being drunk. She decides to do a little investigation and ends up confronting Dolores and Luisa. After enjoying some nice singing and one of the best songs in the movie, she's told to go looking for Bruno, and it's around this time that we learn of Isabella's engagement. When she finds Bruno's room, she finds a shattered prophecy. She goes to put it together and is caught by Felix and Pepa, who sing one of the most successful songs Disney's ever released. She's caught by her father, who tells her not to tell anyone, but Dolores overhears it, and this leads to one of the funniest scenes in the movie, where the news is not supposed to get out, but gossip is to Dolores what water is to fishes, and so it makes its way around the table slowly, and the dinner devolves into chaos. This leads to Mirabel being blamed. She would be all alone when she would notice the prophecy being stolen by rats, which she would then follow until she finds Bruno. She would come to understand his life and how hard it's been for him. She asks him to finish the prophecy, which he does. He reveals to her that she must make amends with her sister if she's to save the miracle. She would go to her sister begrudgingly and attempt to make friends with her. At first, Isabella is of course upset that Mirabel ruined the dinner, but when she makes a cactus with her powers, she realizes that she's made something seemingly imperfect but equally beautiful. After another song, Isabella and Mirabel would patch up their relationship and grow happier and messier. However, Abuelita Alma shows up angry. She blames Mirabel, no surprise, for all of this, but Mirabel goes off script and drops a massive nuclear truth bomb on her grandma. It's true, but it destroys the Casa Madrigal. After everything, Mirabel feels like a total failure and runs away. The Madrigals search desperately to find her, but none of them succeed except for Alma, who finds her at the river where she first lost Pedro, where the miracle began. They talk for a while and eventually make up, with Alma recognizing that she was wrong and had mistreated Mirabel horribly. After a time, she makes up with not only her, but Bruno as well, and they all return to the village where they begin to rebuild. Eventually, everything is rebuilt and the house is dedicated to Mirabel. The magic returns after they rebuild the home and village from scratch, and this causes everyone's abilities to come back and the magic to return. And of course, they all live happily ever after. Or I guess they do, until the sequel, which could happen considering how successful this was. But anyway, what do you think about it? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell for more content like this, and always remember, Frederator loves you.